In a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Denver, Colorado, where the lawns were trimmed like green carpets and the homeowners association ruled like a silent government, there lived a man named Ethan Walker. Ethan wasn't rich or particularly impressive to his neighbors. He worked long shifts in a distribution warehouse, scraping by to pay the mortgage on his modest two-bedroom house. To him, the neighborhood represented stability and hope, a place where he could finally have peace after years of hardship. But for one particular neighbor, peace was the last thing she wanted him to have. Her name was Karen Mitchell, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a middle-aged woman with a perpetual scowl and a thirst for control. Karen had a reputation. She always found something wrong with everyone. A slightly crooked mailbox? She'd file a complaint. A lawn left uncut for 2 days? Expect a fine. But for Ethan, she seemed to reserve a special kind of torment. It started with snide remarks. "People like you lower the property value," she'd sneer while walking her Pomeranian. Ethan ignored her, telling himself she'd eventually get bored. But then came the trash can incidents. Every week on collection day, Ethan followed all the HOA rules to the letter, putting his bin out at the correct time, neatly placed at the curb. And yet every time he returned home from work, he'd find his trash scattered across his yard, his bin knocked over, garbage bags ripped open. At first, he assumed it was a stray dog or maybe the wind. But one evening, as he pulled into his driveway early, he saw her, Karen, marching up the street with her dog in one hand, using her other hand to deliberately shove his trash can over.
Then she looked straight at him and smirked, saying loudly enough for other neighbors to hear, "This neighborhood should stay clean. Maybe if you kept your property nice, we wouldn't have to look at this mess." The humiliation burned inside him. Neighbors turned their heads, some laughing awkwardly, others whispering, all while Ethan clenched his jaw and carried his scattered trash back into bags. He wanted to shout back, but he knew how the HOA worked. Karen had influence, and anyone who stood against her paid dearly in fines and harassment. So he stayed silent, though inside, every insult and every petty act was carving into his pride. Weeks passed, and Karen's torment escalated. She'd leave anonymous complaint letters in his mailbox, reporting imaginary infractions. "Your grass is half an inch too long. Your car looks too old for this neighborhood." Every time Ethan saw her gossiping with other HOA members at the cul-de-sac, pointing toward his house, he felt that sharp stab of shame and anger. One day, he overheard her laughing with her friends, saying, "That guy never belonged here. People like him drag down communities. He'll never be anything." Those words stayed with him long into the night. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he remembered something his late father once told him. "Son, you don't ask people for respect. You make them respect you." That night, something in Ethan shifted. He decided he wasn't going to be the quiet victim anymore. But Ethan wasn't impulsive. He didn't want a screaming match or a petty retaliation. He wanted something bigger, something Karen and the entire neighborhood would never forget. He started staying up late, reading every line of the HOA bylaws online, learning the rules better than the HOA board itself. He took notes, pages and pages of them, while working double shifts at the warehouse to save money. He began formulating a plan, a long game that would turn the tables completely. To the world, he kept his head down, endured Karen's weekly trash can assaults and snide remarks. But inside, his resolve was turning into steel. He pictured the day when she would choke on her arrogance, when the same neighbors laughing at him would look at him with awe and maybe even fear. And most importantly, he promised himself that whatever he did, it would be perfectly legal, because nothing would be sweeter than beating Karen at her own game. The first spark of revenge had been lit, and Ethan knew there was no turning back. Soon, Karen Mitchell was going to learn a lesson about underestimating quiet men with nothing to lose. Ethan kept his head low for weeks, enduring the same routine humiliation as if nothing had changed. But behind closed doors, his life had become an operation. Every evening after his warehouse shift, he sat hunched over his kitchen table with HOA bylaws spread out like war maps, a legal pad filled with scribbled notes, and a determination that burned hotter than ever. He learned things most residents didn't even know existed, archaic clauses, obscure loopholes, and outdated HOA election procedures. While Karen strutted around the cul-de-sac, thinking she ruled the neighborhood, Ethan was quietly gathering weapons that couldn't be seen. He also began networking, something Karen would never expect from him. On weekends, instead of hiding away, he started chatting with the quieter neighbors, the elderly couple 2 houses down who hated Karen's constant complaints about their hedges, the single mother on the corner who Karen once publicly shamed for leaving a stroller outside overnight, and even some board members secretly fed up with Karen's antics, but too intimidated to stand against her. Ethan listened more than he spoke, offering a sympathetic ear, and slowly people began to open up about their own grievances. Every story of Karen's arrogance and bullying was fuel for Ethan's growing case. Meanwhile, he saved every complaint letter she sent him, took time-stamped photos of every time she knocked over his trash can, and even installed a small motion-activated camera hidden in his porch light, a camera Karen didn't know existed. Within 2 months, Ethan had a portfolio of evidence that could not only discredit Karen, but possibly get her removed from the HOA board altogether. But his plan wasn't just about taking her down, it was about taking her place. He learned that HOA board elections were coming up in 6 months, and as per the bylaws, any homeowner in good standing could run. Ethan began drafting a campaign, not a flashy one, but a quiet and devastatingly effective one. He knew most of the residents despised the HOA's overreach, but were too scared to speak up. He would be their voice. He started planting seeds subtly, casually mentioning to neighbors that maybe the HOA should focus on real community improvements rather than nitpicking over trash cans and mailboxes, suggesting that the association's fees could be better spent. He even helped the elderly couple fix their hedge without being asked, mowed the single mom's lawn when her mower broke, and began building goodwill not by talking, but by doing. Karen, oblivious, continued her reign of petty terror, completely unaware that the man she mocked weekly was carefully digging the ground from beneath her. Then, an unexpected stroke of luck accelerated Ethan's timeline. One evening, his hidden porch camera caught something shocking. Karen's dog pooping on his lawn, followed by Karen kicking over his trash can and laughing, all in clear HD footage. The very next day, Karen sent him a formal HOA violation notice claiming his yard was messy and threatening him with a fine. That was the final puzzle piece Ethan needed. He didn't confront her. No, that would ruin everything. Instead, he quietly documented it, added it to his growing file, and doubled down on his plan. Late at night, as he sat alone with his notes, he could almost taste the victory to come. He wasn't just going to get even. He was going to flip the entire power dynamic of the neighborhood. He envisioned Karen's face when she realized she wasn't untouchable, when she would have to stand in front of the very people she tormented and answer for her actions. The more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about him. It was about justice. It was about every neighbor who had been belittled and controlled by someone drunk on a tiny bit of power. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt alive. The humiliation and frustration that had weighed on him had transformed into purpose, into a mission. He began preparing his campaign material, writing speeches, and secretly collecting signatures of support for when the time came. The HOA thought they were untouchable. Karen thought she was the queen. But kings and queens fall hardest when they never see the uprising coming. By the end of the second month, Ethan had everything he needed: video evidence, neighbor testimonies, and a swelling base of quiet supporters. All that was left now was timing, and Ethan was patient. Karen's downfall was coming, and she wouldn't even see the first blow until it was far too late. Election season crept into the neighborhood like an approaching thunderstorm, quietly at first, then with flashes that made everyone look up. Flyers started showing up in mailboxes announcing the upcoming HOA board elections. Karen, smug as ever, assumed her position was unshakable. For years, she had run unopposed, her control so absolute that no one dared challenge her. She didn't even bother campaigning. She simply held her usual coffee and gossip sessions with her allies, assuring them she'd win by default again. But this time, something different was brewing beneath the surface. Ethan, who for months had played the part of the submissive victim, started quietly mobilizing. He had already earned the trust of many neighbors through small acts of kindness, but now he began conversations with intent. Standing by mailboxes in the early evenings, helping a neighbor fix a squeaky gate, or lending a hand with a heavy box became moments of quiet campaigning. He never badmouthed Karen directly. Instead, he spoke about change and accountability, about how the HOA fees could be used to build a small playground for kids or fun neighborhood block parties instead of being spent on arbitrary fines. People listened, and more importantly, they nodded. Word began to spread that someone new was running for the board. Karen, still oblivious, continued her petty reign. She fined a single dad for leaving his trash cans out for an extra day after he was hospitalized. She berated a teenager for parking slightly crooked in her own driveway. She knocked Ethan's can over again and laughed about it to her friends. What she didn't realize was that Ethan had already begun sharing his footage with the neighbors privately. On a quiet Saturday evening, he invited a few trusted residents over for coffee and, without fanfare, showed them the video of Karen knocking his can and her dog defiling his yard. The reaction was electric: gasps, murmurs, and then quiet fury. "She's been fining us for things like this?" the elderly couple whispered, shaking their heads. "And she does it herself?" By the end of that week, Ethan's video had spread like wildfire, passed discreetly phone to phone, until almost every household had seen it. Karen remained blissfully unaware, convinced the whispers in the cul-de-sac were just her admirers praising her leadership. But the tide had turned. When the official HOA candidates list went up, there was Ethan Walker's name right below hers. Karen's eyebrows shot up when she saw it, and for the first time in years, a flicker of insecurity crossed her face. She laughed it off publicly, calling Ethan a charity case trying to play politician, but deep down, something gnawed at her. Ethan didn't rise to her bait. He simply kept showing up, helping neighbors, listening to their complaints, promising to bring fairness. He printed simple, clean flyers listing his goals: more transparency, community improvements, no harassment over petty infractions. They weren't flashy, but they spoke directly to the frustrations people had been harboring for years. As election day approached, Karen finally began to realize she was in trouble. She hastily put together a campaign full of empty promises and veiled insults against Ethan, claiming he was unfit to lead, that people like him didn't understand property values. But the more she attacked, the worse she looked. Neighbors had seen the video. They had felt her bullying firsthand. And Ethan never fought back with insults. He let her dig her own grave while he stayed calm, polite, and helpful. Tension gripped the neighborhood like a coiled spring. On the night of the pre-election HOA meeting, more people showed up than ever before. Karen strutted in with her allies, but there were murmurs she couldn't decipher. Conversations that went quiet when she passed. When Ethan stood up to speak, his voice was steady, his hands firm. He didn't mention her name. He simply laid out his vision for the community, spoke about fairness and mutual respect, and ended with a simple promise: no one should ever feel humiliated in their own neighborhood. The applause that followed stunned even him. Karen sat frozen, her smile twitching nervously. For the first time, she realized she might actually lose. But Karen wasn't one to give up power without a fight, and Ethan knew the next few weeks would be the most dangerous yet. She would throw everything she had at him: lies, intimidation, maybe even retaliation worse than knocked over trash cans. But Ethan was ready. The quiet storm he'd been building for months was now roaring, and Karen was standing right in its path without an umbrella. As the election drew closer, Karen's desperation became visible to everyone. The polite smirk she once wore with such confidence hardened into a sneer. Her gossip sessions turned into outright smear campaigns. Overnight, anonymous flyers appeared on doorsteps accusing Ethan of being a troublemaker with a history of financial instability, and false claims circulated that he planned to abolish all HOA rules, letting the neighborhood fall apart. Ethan knew exactly where these lies were coming from, but he didn't react publicly. Instead, he doubled down on his strategy of quiet, undeniable facts. He calmly provided his financial records to supporters who asked, showing he was responsible and in good standing with the HOA. He reminded people of his actual proposals: transparency, fair enforcement of rules, and investment in community well-being. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics got uglier. One night, Ethan's car tires were mysteriously slashed. Another day, a complaint letter arrived accusing him of running an illegal business from his garage, a blatant fabrication. Ethan anticipated this escalation. In fact, his porch camera caught a figure suspiciously similar to Karen creeping near his driveway on the night his tires were slashed. Instead of confronting her, he added the footage to his growing arsenal of evidence. He contacted a lawyer quietly, not to sue yet, but to make sure everything he did was by the book. While Karen thought intimidation would scare him off, Ethan remained steady, knowing that panicking now would play into her hands. Then came the final HOA debate night, the only official event where all candidates spoke publicly. The community center was packed to the brim. More residents than anyone could remember had shown up, many of them simmering with years of resentment toward Karen's petty tyranny. She strutted onto the stage, hair perfect, posture rigid, ready to destroy Ethan with rhetoric. But when a moderator gave her the floor, her speech sounded hollow. Promises to maintain standards, vague references to protecting property values, and veiled attacks on outsiders who don't fit in. The room was lukewarm. When Ethan took the microphone, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't attack her by name. Instead, he projected calm conviction. He told the story of moving to the neighborhood with hope, of wanting peace, and of how he learned that respect should flow both ways. Then, with perfect timing, he said, "Rules should protect us, not humiliate us. No one here should be above the rules, and no one here should feel unsafe for standing up for themselves." He didn't need to name Karen. Every person in that room knew what he meant. Then he made his boldest move. Ethan calmly presented printed handouts with documented violations of HOA rules committed by current board members, including the photos and videos he'd gathered over months. Karen kicking his trash, her dog defecating on multiple lawns, timestamps of her ignoring HOA's own pet waste policies. Gasps rippled across the room. Karen's face flushed crimson as whispers turned to murmurs. She tried to shout that it was fake, but Ethan had the original files ready on a projector, unedited and clear. "I don't bring this up to humiliate anyone," he said evenly. "I bring it up because fairness should be for everyone, and hypocrisy has no place in leadership." The applause this time was thunderous. Karen sputtered, her words drowned out by the clapping and murmurs of residents finally realizing they had the power to change things. That night, Karen stormed home and reportedly screamed at several board members over the phone, but Ethan stayed quiet, knowing the votes would speak louder than any shouting match. When Election Day arrived, the turnout shattered HOA records. Families showed up who hadn't voted in years. Some elderly residents who Karen had harassed personally asked Ethan to walk them to the voting table. The result wasn't even close. Ethan won in a landslide, taking the highest number of votes in HOA history. Karen lost her board seat entirely. The look on her face when the results were announced was the moment Ethan had envisioned for months. Disbelief, humiliation, the collapse of a self-appointed queen who thought she could never fall. But Ethan didn't gloat. He simply shook hands, thanked his supporters, and left quietly. For him, the victory wasn't about Karen's tears. It was about reclaiming dignity, not just for himself, but for every neighbor she had oppressed. Yet, Karen wasn't done. The days following her loss saw her simmering with vengeance, muttering about legal action and revenge. Ethan knew she might lash out one last time, and he was ready. His plan wasn't over. He had one final surprise that would end this war permanently and make sure no Karen-like tyrant ever controlled the neighborhood again. In the days following her crushing defeat, Karen retreated into the shadows of her own bitterness. But everyone knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. She had spent years ruling the HOA through intimidation, and losing that power left her scrambling for any way to reassert control. Whispers floated through the neighborhood that she was threatening lawsuits, calling the HOA office at all hours, claiming Ethan's election was rigged, and even accusing her former friends on the board of betraying her. But while Karen fumed, Ethan remained calm and patient, just as he had been from the very beginning. He knew from experience that people like Karen often self-destruct when they lose their power, and his role now wasn't to fight her directly, but to make sure the community stayed united. In his first official week on the HOA board, Ethan implemented the very changes he'd promised. An online portal where residents could see exactly where HOA fees went, a fair warning system instead of arbitrary fines, and a simple, transparent complaint process. These changes, while small, sent a clear message. The HOA existed to serve the community, not the other way around. Neighbors were thrilled. Morale shifted almost overnight. Even those who'd once stood with Karen begrudgingly admitted the neighborhood felt lighter, friendlier. And as for Karen, her last act of desperation arrived sooner than anyone expected. One evening. Just a month after the election, Ethan received an anonymous letter stuffed into his mailbox. No return address, just a crudely written threat. You think you've won, but you're going down. You don't belong here. I'll make sure of it. Ethan smiled grimly. The writing was sloppy but unmistakable. His porch camera caught Karen sneaking up to his mailbox that night, hood pulled over her head. This time, Ethan didn't just add it to his personal file. He reported it directly to the police. Harassment, vandalism, and intimidation were crimes, and now there was hard evidence. The officers didn't dismiss him. They were well aware of Karen's reputation from other complaints. Within days, Karen received a formal warning, and the neighbors got wind of it. Whatever sympathy she had left evaporated. Her bitterness escalated into a public meltdown. One morning, she stood in her driveway screaming at passing cars, calling Ethan a fraud and yelling that the neighborhood had turned against her. Instead of making Ethan look bad, her outburst cemented what everyone already knew. Karen had become her own worst enemy. Ethan, however, wasn't done with his final stroke. At the next HOA meeting, now packed with residents eager to hear about the community's future, he calmly presented a proposal to adopt a community code of respect. It was a simple document signed by dozens of neighbors, stating that harassment, intimidation, and public humiliation would no longer be tolerated from anyone, residents or board members alike. Violations would be met with warnings, fines, and, if necessary, legal action. The proposal passed unanimously. Karen, now just another resident with no allies left, sat in the back of the room, silent and seething as her own former tactics were turned into rules that protected others from people like her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ethan didn't gloat, didn't even look her way. His revenge had never been about petty satisfaction. It had been about justice, and that mission was now complete. Over the following months, the neighborhood transformed. Kids played outside without fear of being scolded for leaving toys on lawns. Elderly residents hosted block parties without worrying about noise complaints. Ethan spearheaded a small community garden project funded with HOA fees, a direct symbol of a new era of cooperation and respect. And as for Karen, she grew quieter and quieter. Some said she put her house up for sale, unable to stand living in a neighborhood that no longer feared her. Others claimed she stayed, but rarely left her home. Her former reign reduced to bitter memories. Whatever the case, one thing was certain. Karen Mitchell would never knock over Ethan Walker's trash can again on the one-year anniversary of his election. Ethan stood on his porch watching the sun set over the street that had once been a prison of humiliation. Now it was home. His trash can sat neatly at the curb, untouched. A few kids on bikes waved at him as they passed, and neighbors smiled as they watered their lawns. It wasn't about power or revenge anymore. It was about peace. Ethan had taken everything Karen threw at him and turned it into fuel. And in the end, she had been undone not by shouting or fists, but by patience, strategy, and the unwavering belief that bullies fall hardest when you let them trip over their own arrogance. The war was over, and Ethan had won in every way that mattered.